These are period tracking apps. Millions of people around the world use them to track their menstrual cycles. But what if these little apps know more about you than you'd think? With just a few taps, these apps can collect highly sensitive data, information like your health history and even pregnancy status. But the real concern? What happens to that data? In an age where personal data is worth more than oil, companies are more than eager to get their hands on it. And period tracking apps are no exception. Today we're speaking with Jordan Wrigley, a data and policy analyst from the Future of Privacy Forum, to find out why you should care where your data goes. So, welcome back to the podcast. Today we have on the show Jordan Wrigley. Today we'll be exploring the critical privacy issues surrounding period tracking apps and the evolving landscape of health data in a post-Roe world. First of all, I just want to kind of ask you, what are your biggest privacy concerns you see with how period tracking apps handle user data?
Well, of course, it depends on the app and the company. And I appreciate the question because there's a lot of variance between data practices across all the apps. And it's one of the key challenges with privacy is what I like to call privacy literacy. This is a conversation that happens a lot amongst librarians and other information literacy and information science professionals, where part of the issue is the onus is on the individual and the user of the app to assess how that app is using their data. So one of the biggest challenges I see is the inconsistencies and standards in app usage and data usage from those apps, and then also the literacies around how privacy works within those apps.
Yeah, like when we read the terms of privacy, we generally tend to skip that screen a bit.
We
But
do.
yeah. I think the user going into the app generally expects that the app somehow makes it better or like more efficient to manage their health data, improving their experience, but ironically, it does the opposite. So, just kind of going into the more policy sector of this, in your opinion, how has the overturning of Roe v. Wade kind of affected the use of period tracking apps?
It's definitely now higher stakes. Very unfortunately, as you said, in many cases, period tracking apps can help folks who are menstruating track, understand, get a sense of their menstruation trends over time, help them better understand their health in relation to it. Unfortunately, what's happened since the Dobbs decision in 2022 is that in many cases, individuals have had to be a lot more careful with the apps they're using and consider more carefully what risks are posed to them by using such apps. In addition, in the lawmaking space, it's also kind of forced the hand of lawmakers who are seeking to protect reproductive data privacy rights. So lawmakers have had to pass several laws and felt compelled to pass several laws that are protecting reproductive data specifically or sensitive data in general, that are very expansive and cover a lot, which in many ways provides great protections, but also provides challenges to the companies who are trying to provide the service of period tracking apps. Um, I don't think anyone user or individual or company wants to be caught in a interstate battle over something like an abortion or a miscarriage. But that's sort of the challenge we're at. So we're seeing this tension between trying to make sure that these really cool apps, these really valuable health supportive tools are accessible, but the data is still protected.
Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that because I think a lot of users are actually worried about their data being used to be, prosecuted by law as an abortion or a miscarriage may be tracked through their data. So
Mhm.
I just wanted to ask you, given your experience at the Future of the Privacy Forum, what policies do you think should be implemented? Like, as you mentioned, there are being a lot of widespread policies being implemented right now that are kind of difficult, but what do you think should be improved upon?
So this is a really difficult but really important question. We sometimes refer this as a wicked problem because it's a problem with no easy answer that even though we really want one. But what I think needs to happen in terms of policies is transparency amongst, company and app data use and privacy policies or notices so that users can very clearly assess the risk of being prosecuted or that data being used in any sort of law enforcement action. As well as also within states, it would be great to see laws take shape in a way that sort of, this is the really difficult part, and by no means any lawmakers who are listening to this, I do not think this is easy, navigate between protecting individuals who are using these apps for menstruation tracking and health supportive purposes and maintaining access to those and that valuable information about their health, while also protecting it from individuals and bad actors who may use that information to restrict access to healthcare.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Um, yeah, I completely agree with that. I've never actually thought of it from that perspective, of the lawmaker's perspective, so I think that's really important. I also want to ask you one last question of how do you see the future of digital health apps involving privacy, especially with more sensitive data like health information and reproductive health information being collected?
So that is a challenge, and it's hard to pull out a crystal ball. Lord knows I wish I had one. But I definitely perceive right now there's a trend among state lawmakers and to some extent federal agencies like HHSOCR and FTC to sort of rebuild the rights we had under Dobbs and Roe originally, before Dobbs, that is, under Roe. Um, that protected folks seeking reproductive health care and by extensively gender affirming care, which often are interlinked these days. We're seeing a trend to try and rebuild those same protections brick by brick, state by state, bill by bill, regulation by regulation, rule by rule, is to try and rebuild that same constitutional right to privacy. Now, I always like to point out here, our friend, bless her soul, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, pointed out that some of the challenges around our right to reproductive privacy maybe hinge not optimally on privacy itself, that the right to reproductive health care should be a right around gender equality rather than necessarily the right to keep your health care a secret and a business between you and your provider. So Ruth knew what was going to happen. Ruth knew best, is what I like to say. But indeed, we had come to expect and believe in those established rights based on privacy. So now the trend is in the future, and I think we will see this ongoing, is that we will continue to see states and protective states, protective agencies at the federal level try and rebuild those rights to the extent they can and maybe extend them farther even. Again, going back to what I said before, the challenges here, a lot of that protection, if it extends to a certain point, it will also start disrupting many of the inequalities we had been in the process of trying to fix before, such as women's representation and non-binary representation in clinical research and health research, representation in data. For any of the listeners out there, I highly recommend Invisible Women by Carolyn Criado Perez. Fabulous book on how women are not represented day to day in the data, and we really need to be. And that makes it really sad. In addition to just losing our rights in many states, we're also losing traction on being able to address that lack of representation.
Mhm. And that's a whole giant other issue of how women are just not studied enough. But
True.
yeah, I think those are all really crucial considerations to this point. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but do you have any last closing thoughts that you want the listeners to just kind of know?
I think one thing I like to throw out there now, because it's become a bit of a confusion point, is we agree and we understand that the vast majority of the time, 90+% of the time, data collected via apps, consumer apps, including period trackers, is not covered by HIPAA. Typically, the rule of understanding is that if you are in a doctor's office with a provider, nurse, doctor, dentist, etc., typically that will be protected by HIPAA and confidentiality. It's worth all individuals understanding that now we have what we call the state patchwork of protections for reproductive privacy and general privacy around health data or sensitive data, and that it does for each individual to kind of think about what their data privacy rights are and what their data privacy risks are given the state and the context they're in, without necessarily assuming that HIPAA covers their health data.
Yeah, I think that's an assumption that a lot of people do make. I just want to thank you for your time and also for your great responses. I'm sure that the listeners will love this. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was so great to speak with you.